I did a funny face on it. I went when we started, and it stuck, and yay. Okay, so any comments on Winona LaDuke? Did anybody go to the web and watch any more information of her? Oh my gosh, there it is. No. She's out there in politics. She's out there on the news sites. You'll see her. She's active. And so it's important that we keep track of what she's up to, right? Let's see. How did we start this reading? Is it that one? The rule of collection. Hold on. Let me just open it right here. There we go. The ethics of collection material. Did I get the wrong one? Oh, there it is. There it is. Just a second. So, right before we start our section on science and scientific methods, okay? Any comments about her discussion about DNA? I mean, we're talking about DNA as it relates to remains and things like that. But why do we care about DNA? Has anybody ever done their DNA testing? Anybody here? No? Not a single one of you? For reals? I did mine. I was super interested. I was like, and set it off, right? And you find out what happens. I'm 47% Central Norwegian. I didn't know it was that strong. Bless you, right? I had no idea it was that strong. So that was kind of interesting to me. Later on, they broke down a little bit of a Swedish part of my line, which was interesting. And then there's a whole amalgamation on the other side of all kinds of things that European mixes, right? So anybody been interested in doing their DNA?
No.
Now you are. Yeah, it's cool. It's interesting. You can even see like little arrows of immigration lines and dates and all kinds of stuff, and they start to link you up. Okay, so how expensive do you think it is?
Is it like 100?
Mine was $20.
Oh.
And I got all of that. It wasn't the 23andMe, it was the Ancestry, right? But they had some special deal during the holiday, so you can look for these advertisements and like do it. I mean, $20, right? So what might be a concern about doing it? Is anybody concerned about? Yes, go for it.
Recently, a lot of companies either like sold their information or gave access of their information to, I think it was FBI.
Oh, access to the FBI. That's not cool.
Yeah.
Right. I thought we had privacy agreements that we signed, right? Okay, so that's not cool. Anybody else with any other concerns? Yes.
Well, mine's a little more selfish. I feel like it would like break any like preconceived notions on the what I have to think I am. I've always grown up thinking I was like 100% Chinese, and then like if that's not true, I'll be like,
whoa.
You know?
Yeah.
It's kind of like that Twitter, like that tweet that was like, oh, my Italian family just found out we're like German or something.
Right. And it's shocking to you, right? Okay, very interesting. We also have a lot of different kinds of interpretation of DNA too. So when we're analyzing proximity between different groups, this is a little bit sticky yet. So we haven't got a widely accepted theory in terms of the details of proximity. So that's another thing. Number of Native Hawaiians have been very concerned about the testing of their blood and what it means. And why do you think that is?
What was the question?
A number of Native Hawaiians have been very concerned about the testing of their blood. Yes?
Is it related to the percentages that Native people deal with on?
That's one thing, right? Okay, so good. We'll talk about that in just a second. Awesome that you brought it up, right? Another is talking about possible traces of their immigration patterns and thereby maybe making use of rights to land versus no rights to land, right? So this is something that we can maybe use in terms of that kind of a concept. Same thing for other areas around the world, as you can imagine, right? If we're talking about land and land rights and saying certain people are indigenous versus not, their blood results are going to be saying some things. And if we've got some issues about how we do that, it's going to be confusing at best. So DNA has been an issue for us, okay? Also, playing off of that, and what she just started talking about, is that we have a different way of defining Indigenous people here, okay? So internationally, we have what's called a working definition for Indigenous people, and we can go over that in a little bit, right? But per country, we also have the ability to define who's Indigenous and who's not, and write what that definition is. Okay, for example, Nicaragua, your definition for indigeneity, they've defined it in law as these groups are Indigenous, right? And then they said, to be considered a part of those groups will affirm your membership or not, right? So it's up to those groups that state whether or not you're a member, okay? What was it today that it just came out with? Let me look this up. Let's see. Sama, news. Did. It was yesterday. Okay. So UN Watchdog says Finland violated the indigenous rights of Sama. How did they do that? If you look right here, it says they breached the political rights of its Sama it's pronounced Sama population. The UN Human Rights Committee ruled on Monday, saying that they violated their right to internal self-determination. What does that mean? Or internal, we get it, but what's
Govern themselves.
govern themselves? Self-determination is kind of like that idea about plans. Remember when we defined culture and we said, oh, it includes plans, right? Like plans of the future, plans of who you want to be, plans of your government, right? So self-determination would be that right to be able to determine your own plans and your own membership, okay? So here, unlawfully, they interfered on the people's right to decide who can participate in elections and decide on their representatives, okay? So this is something that we've said all along, that we appreciate this right to be able to have what we call self-determination, right? To determine for themselves. So Nicaragua is really on board with that whole concept. And a lot of new laws coming out, especially in Latin America, are very much on board with those concepts. What's our country say? What does it take to be called Indigenous? I'll say one thing that you might not be able to throw in there just because it's not commonly listed. One thing is that your genealogy or genealogical line connection, tribal connection, must go back 500 years, okay? So it has to be 500 years ago, whatever that group is. Now, what's the other thing that you need? Pretty much if you don't have it, don't call yourself a tribal member or even try.
Is it blood quantum?
Yes. How much?
Changed it relatively.
Kind of changed it. They gave some options to change it. So what's the current number? This is also actually the same number for getting rights to Hawaiian homelands for Native Hawaiians. So what's the percentage number? Who thinks it's over 50? Okay, what about over 40? Okay, what about over 10? Is it over 10%? Okay, it's 25%. Okay, so let me give you an example of what that means. Okay, so in Native Hawaiian cases for state Hawaiian homelands, right? You can acquire land, okay? No longer can it be built for you. You also have to pay for it being built, okay? So you can acquire land as a Native Hawaiian with rights to homelands if you have 25%, right? Now, let's say you're getting older, right? And you have a bunch of kids, although they don't have that same 25%. That Hawaiian homeland now gets taken out of the family, and those family members will need to find a new home. Okay? This is similar to what happens with tribal checks here. If your blood quantum is dropping below 25%, you don't qualify. Right? So if you have a family member that is your parental unit, right, your mother or father that's 25%, and you don't have that, that means that tribal benefit, that tribal check, and those connections as tribal members is over because you no longer have that percentage. Okay. What do we think about that?
I think it's pretty silly. If you're
Yeah.
practicing the culture as part of the community, who are also practicing the culture,
Right.
and you have ancestry in that not section, people,
Mm-hmm.
then you should have the same rights.
Should be able to protect, right? We're talking about being able to protect into the future. If we so desire, right, we ought to be able to protect. Okay, good. Any other comments?
But also marry who you want to marry.
Right. Okay. You also ought to be able to marry who you want to marry. Okay. What about the flip side? What about individuals that just have 5%, a couple of percents, haven't been able to trace their lineage very much? What do you think about that? Right? If we drop the limit, open it up a bit more, that's a whole lot more people, isn't it? Okay, maybe they have connections, maybe they don't. So we've got some concerns in this way with this issue of blood. Let's take a look at something that came out last week. I want to see No, that's not. Okay, this just came out, this South Dakota, maybe? Was it this one? Just a moment here. Oh, I'm gonna have to look up on the actual link, but it might have some reference in here. Okay, there's a recent case that was out in the news, okay? And I want to say it's South Dakota. It's in the Dakotas, okay? And one of the cases that we have is talking about the removal of children. Remember, we've been talking about the removal of children? We've just discovered that this is still going on in a massive level in this one group. And so it's just come out in the news, so you should expect to see reference to the removal of Native kids from their tribal units and then putting them elsewhere, okay? Yes?
Who's enforcing these laws?
Who's enforcing the laws of removing them, or who's enforcing, those are state laws that they're doing. Oftentimes Native groups have been targeted. When we talk about removing kids from families, what are the conditions that we tend to do that in?
Parents are unfit.
Unfit. Okay, so, and that could be a range of alcoholism, drugs, abuse, or what else? Finance. Okay, so we could have any number of these issues that we're dealing with, and we can use them almost as an excuse to target even more. Okay, so the suggestion is that's what has happened, that it's above and beyond what is normal in the community around, and in like statistics. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so one of the reasons why I'm bringing this up about kids being removed from their Indigenous families is thinking about a child that might have 25% or more being removed like this, even as a baby or young child, and growing up not to know about this connection with the tribe, testing their DNA and finding, wow, I'm full, whatever it might be, right? So that's another concern that we have, especially for kids like this that are being removed or disconnected from those families and parts of the tribe, is that this concern about maintaining that. So good that she mentions DNA in here, albeit much more related to bodies and archaeological data. Okay. Anything else that you have reference to Winona LaDuke's piece here? She speaks a lot about NAGPRA. Fairly common comments about relatives being poisoned. Have we seen a lot of this in the news about Indigenous people talking about the poisoning of their people? Have we seen very much about that? No. Have you? In what area?
Facebook.
Facebook, okay. And related to what kind of poisoning?
It depends on the forum. Some of them are talking about just environmentally.
Right.
Other ones talk about culturally.
Oh, okay, like poison of the mind in terms of poisoning people's minds. Yeah, wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, a lot of what I've read has been more environmental, right? Related to the Dakota pipeline and the like, you know, our big, huge concern about that kind of contamination and what it means for water. So interesting that we have that reference here. I think that's all I have to comment on this reading. Again, I'm still astounded by that last quote. Who would think we would have to bury our ancestors twice? Yeah. Wow, it's powerful comments. Okay, so let's get on with talking about science, right? We had a lot of arguments about science with the social sciences. One of the things that we said was sounding almost postmodern in that, where are they? I got a new pair of glasses. Actually, not new. I just borrowed some, right? So I still lost my glasses, right? So this idea that how can we possibly do science when all of our observations are clearly colored by all the lenses that we're wearing, right? Our cultural lenses, which seem virtually impossible to take off, right? Especially when we're talking with postmodernists and interpretivists, okay? But we do have this thinking that, you know, we are still considered a science, and it's possible that we could ask questions of people like, how many bags of taro did you harvest in the last week? Or how many stilt birds did you see this morning, by example, and come up with something really definitive, right? Some exact numbers and the like. In fact, we could take some of those numbers and observations and say, how many hours this week, this day, whatever have you, did you spend harvesting in your taro field? And get an exact number. And also get the exact numbers of the birds that were counted that week, right? And maybe even see the relationship between the farmer moving around on the farm and also the birds moving around on the farm after the farmer. Go figure, right? Talking about using the land and digging it up where all those bugs and those crawdads and those fish and those other things are coming to the surface, and we see birds acting appropriately as the farmer moves around the farm. So we can say that we can see some specific data here, right? But for me to assert, well, this kind of taro group or taro farmer knows a lot more than this kind of taro group is difficult for me to assess. Getting into knowledge, real specifically, might be difficult for me to assess. Yeah, I can have them make a list of all the taro varieties they know, or the birds they know, or all the plants in their fields that they know, which we did, which was really cool, right? But assessing who has more over another was difficult in that scenario, right? Certainly, I think that taro farmers have more knowledge than scientists writing about it that aren't taro farmers, but maybe not much more that we could say beyond that. In essence, though, we have been arguing about two different kinds of cultures. You see these links here. The New York Times, Our Two Cultures, and we have a famous gentleman by the name of C.P. Snow that wrote about the two cultures. And he said, gosh darn it, you know, when we started really getting into education and science, we took them and we split them in two, right? I mean, we did it today too, right? We have the natural sciences on campus and we have the social sciences on campus. This is how we teach our sciences, is completely divided and separate. We don't tend to teach as much about the scientific method in our social sciences than we do in the natural sciences, which are obviously grounded in it, right? So we have this discussion of what indeed happened during the scientific revolution, and did it cause us to split our ideas of social and natural in such a way that we think that humans not even a part of the natural environment. All right. So some of us in anthropology do still rely on these methods. I would say that we don't rely on them wholly in that we combine them with others, right? I certainly take field notes like crazy, jottings, little doodlies of everything that's happening. I come back, I start writing up my field notes, right? I write up all kinds of field notes, like the conversation that I had with my mom and dad that was great, or the conversation that I had with a friend that was not so great, right? Because it's possible that while I'm writing up these kinds of things, I'm not considering that other issues are influencing me, right? So I do combine those kinds of methods as well as others with a scientific method. Bless you. So that we're able to get the information in many different kinds of ways, right? Okay, but don't want to deny the scientific method. So important in all of this is taking a look at testing and variables, setting up your independent and your dependent variables. I know you all have had a lot to do with learning these kinds of things in science, but let's talk about some of the particulars, because we can set up, let's say, knowledge of indigenous people of the environment as one variable, and say it might affect another variable in terms of, let's say, the cutting of trees or whatever have you. Yes? Essentially, what we want to look at might be something called conservation, right? I mean, that's like huge nowadays. We want to know if people are conserving. We want to know if they're not conserving, right? Okay, so if we're going to measure conservation in these terms, oh, these indigenous people conserve, these don't, or we don't and they do, right? How are we going to define conservation? Like, let's throw it into the mix here, but the operational definition of conservation might be difficult, right? Usually I use the example of alcoholism. I've done it so many years, let's move on, okay? Let's try and take the definition of conservation. How would we define it? Don't tell me the number of bottles that you save in a week, right? Yes?
Preserving the natural habitat of land you're on.
Okay, so preserving the natural habitat of land that you're on. So preservation, oh my gosh, where's my pens? Again, like I come in here and they take all the pens. It's not fair. No, okay, so let's see. We'll just keep this in our mind. Oh, yay! Okay, so preservation, you said, was the word?
Yes.
Preservation.
It likely doesn't capture everything.
Preservation, and we like the term land, and you said on, could we say using?
You could say using.
Or on, okay, so.
If you're using it specifically here, you're probably not preserving what was naturally there already.
Right, or using, okay, so one of the things that we tend to incorporate in the definition of conservation is restraint. Agreed? Okay, just say yes, right? I mean, I've been working. Okay, restraint. Okay, so restraint, and we usually say like for how long, right? So we're concerned that maybe, most common, we say 7 generations. So we want to restrain our interaction with the land to make sure that the land has the same qualities in the next 7 generations. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's what we think of in terms of conservation. Now, preservation is an issue for me.
Yep.
What can we do with that word?
Change to incorporate, well, because by preserve.
Keep the same?
Yeah, that's what it
Okay,
is.
so
you don't, it isn't what it
keep
is.
the same.
But we don't like it that way.
And
It's like
our
that.
current terms of that would be an ecosystem, right? Ecosystem, we want to keep the same. Ecosystem or biome, whatever you want to call it, right? So we want to keep it the same. Restraint, what do we mean by that? This is what we're talking about. This is defining the variables in our research. We need to be able to figure out what we're going to try and measure, because we can't measure it if, right? First of all, measuring for 7 generations is really difficult to think about, right? But we can maybe do some kind of mathematical modeling in terms of the use of land, right? But restraint, We want to measure, are people not doing what they could do and what they could benefit from for the purpose of the future, right? So we would have to figure out what's the potential that people can get out of a piece of land, right? And then measure that and see how much percentage they were actually doing. And then we would have to decide, well, how much percentage do we mean restraint? Is it 50%, 70? Could be like anything from 74% down is, but 75, you see what I mean? So we have to be real specific when we're looking at our research to define things. And to that regard, we can define things in ways that don't make much sense, right? Incorporating things, making studies look a certain way, like they're more reliable or more valid even, by the way that we're just setting up our problem, right? Okay, so something to think about in terms of how we're looking at the operational definitions and how we're measuring them, right? So I might, for example, ask you a question on your midterm saying, how would you define good grades? What would you say? Answers that could be acceptable could be all A's or 3.7 or even a 2.5, right? Or a, okay, just so long as you're defining it in ways that make sense. Is that clear? Yeah? Okay. Let's see here. Okay, so another thing that we need to think about is that we want to be able to do a study, but do it so it doesn't last for hundreds and hundreds of years. What I mean by that is if we were to study the student body of University of Redlands, how many are we?
Like 3,000.
3,000. If we incorporate the upper class or the graduate school, maybe it's 5, 3 to 5, somewhere around in there. Is that right? Or am I off?
Yeah, that's right.
More or less?
Yeah, it's 5,000.
So let's say that we want to study the students of Redlands, and there's 5,000. And our study incorporates maybe a 30-minute questionnaire. When are we going to get done? I don't know. Hardly never, right? I mean, look at, that's a lot of people to try and interview, right? Okay. So one of the things that we do in this kind of a scenario is we take a sample, right? And we'll take a sample in various forms. So one way that we could take a sample is taking a look at whoever arrives first on campus, right? And sit down and talk with them and then say, hey, do you know any other students that we could talk to? And they say, oh yeah, sure, my friend comes in. And they find some other people. And we do the same thing every time we interview. We ask them, oh, do you know some people and can you show us? We call that snowball sampling. Does it make sense? Because what does a snowball do when it goes down a hill? Gets bigger, right? So the more people we talk to, the bigger it gets. What do we think of that kind of sample?
It's likely to skew toward one community.
Exactly, right? Because I'm asking all my friends or all the friends of friends, right? Okay. So then another kind of way that we could do is we could, let's see, take a list of all the students and take every 10th one, right? We could call that a random sample, okay? But here's the thing. We might have different groupings of students, like some are graduate students, some are undergraduate students, some are early risers, some are part-timers, right? And if we wanted to study something like what are the study habits of students at University of Redlands, we got like a real big variety of different kinds of students, right? So alternatively, maybe what we do is we get the group of all the graduate students and take every 5th one, right? And then all the off-campus students, by example, right? So we would call that a stratified random sample. Stratified meaning we put them into groups, right? We talk about stratification, that's like class stratification in our economy. First class, second, lower class, upper class, middle class, that's stratification, okay? So we put them into groups and then we randomly sample, okay? Eventually we're getting information from those that we sampled and we call it, well, we call the numbers that we want to use useful for inferential statistics, okay? We want to be able to take the results of who we studied to be able to infer This makes sense? Infers something about the larger population. Okay, so that's why it's called inferential statistics, because we're using the sample to say something about the bigger population. Of course, if we sampled wrong, we're going to screw it all up, right? Okay. So we've got stratified sample, simple random sample, and snowball sample in that. Okay. I'm going to just kind of keep going through here. All right. Some of the interviews that I've done have been what we call free listing, and I've just mentioned that. Okay. Free listing is something where we can ask people to make a list of things. Okay. This is something that I used to. I haven't done it in a while. If we have some extra time, we'll do it. Right. I used to ask all my students to make a list of all the animals they knew and all the trees. I think I used to do as well. Right. Animals was so much fun. And I did it the first couple of years that I was here, and I did it for about 7 years on Kauai. So what do you think my lists on Kauai had? Pardon? Nene was on it, right? About maybe 60% of the list, maybe almost up to 70% of the list were in one ecological region. What do you think it was? Ocean. Yes, fish. Oh my gosh, lists of fish, right? Fish in Japanese terms, Hawaiian terms, English terms, scientific terms, just lists and lists. Ahupua, right? What is it? The huma huma nuku nuku apua, right? Okay. Amazing lists, okay? What do you think were the first three on most of the lists, regardless of location? Cat, dog, who else? Bear. Okay, that's that top 10, top 15, right? Cat, dog, mouse, yeah. Cow, yeah, bird. Bird was in that top 20 area. Okay, so you can see there are some things that we would expect in the top parts of the list. So that we would call agreement, right? That we would call generalized knowledge. When I did this with taro farmers and we listed taro varieties, I had some that I had about 26% on the list that were only listed by one person. What do you think about that? I surveyed the taro farmers in the state. Of 34 taro farmers in the state of Hawaii, 26% of the taros listed, the taro plants listed, were listed only by one farmer. What does that mean? What does that tell us? Yes.
He knows a lot about taro.
Oh yes. And it's not just the same farmer. I should have explained that. It's not just the same farmer, but of those varieties only listed, right, all listed, 26% of them were only listed by one person. Not different people, obviously, right? Oh, I mean, not obviously, but that's what I meant. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay. So 26% only had one person listing them. Might have been a different person. Okay. But we're talking about the knowledge of taro. So what does that tell us about the knowledge of taro? Pardon? Very limited. Okay. And in terms of being shared, right? So let's think on that level. If we only have one person listing this one variety or listing 25% of the list, right? And we have some agreement on the rest of the list, right? Okay, everybody comes up with the first five. Yeah, we all got that. Cat, dog, or, right? Maui lehua, Kauai lehua. These are the different varieties of taro, right? But it also means that when we have only one farmer listing some of these varieties, that's what we call specialized knowledge. And that means that only that one person has it, or just maybe two. And get this, it was all within one watershed. So the knowledge of those special varieties was all in this one watershed, and it was in a watershed that wasn't currently protected by the state or by the feds either. Oh, my language, sorry. So we have some knowledge there that needs to be protected. We know it's not being protected because even the group is endangered by the lack of protection of the state and the feds. You see what I'm talking about? So when we do free listing, all kinds of amazing things come out. I didn't know that that kind of knowledge was like that. I didn't know people didn't share the knowledge. I didn't know that the people in that one ahupua'a or watershed were so endangered as taro farmers, right? Out of all of the state. Now let me put one more layer of politics on top of this for you. All of those farmers in that one ahupua'a were state farmers on state farm land, which meant their land rights came up every 12 months. Do you remember how long it took to grow a taro crop? 14 to 16 months. That means their fields are planted. Their fields are planted when their land comes up for lottery, and anyone can outbid them. Oh my gosh. It kind of puts another layer of endangerment of their culture, their knowledge, and everything that might be embodied in their being taro farmers in their watershed. Okay, so this is an example as to these kinds of research surveys can give you information that can then help you protect them, right? Like I report this to the state and say, look at this, right? They're endangered and their knowledge is special and we got to protect them, right? As maybe I wouldn't have done so if I wouldn't have found that information. Okay. All right. So archival research, meaning research in books, is something that's critical that we do before we go into the field, even for what we would call testing things like a pilot research. Okay. And longitudinal research. Take a look at the word long. The word long in there is about time. This is about time research done over time. So my weekly data collection of bird counts, as well as hours spent in various parts of the taro fields, would be considered a time kind of study. Right? I had a colleague also that had a theory that in some cultures where it's dangerous in wild places and forests and things like that, that we have a tendency to have slower motor development for babies. Weird, right? Like, well, that's a weird thought. I've never thought about that. That's very strange, right? Well, she said, you know, here's my thought. She said, most often, if it's too dangerous for the kids on the ground, we go like this, right? And we hold them, right? As opposed to having the kid being on the ground and just kind of doing all that they need to do, right? So we're holding them tighter, and therefore the baby's neck muscles aren't developing as much, right? And so that being one of the first parts of the lack of motor development. So for her longitudinal study, she sat in the corner of certain huts and said, baby on the ground, baby in the lap, baby on the ground, baby on the lap, right? And just literally over time tracked how much time the kid was on the ground versus being held, right? And lo and behold, she found out that that was part of the relationship between the motor skills and the swaddling, right? Time. Okay. Group discussions are lots of fun. I used to do that all the time down in the with the taro farmers. We'd go to breakfast, get a whole bunch of food, right? So everybody's all, you know, happy and talking, especially with sugar, right? Bring cookies and stuff like that, they used to tell us. And then pose a question. How do you feel about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? Or, right, how do you feel about not being able to control the numbers of birds on your fields? Or any number of things you can throw out, and the conversation goes in ways that you wouldn't expect it, right? Because it's a conversation between others, not you, right? You're there participating and being there and listening, but amazing things that can be learned out of that. Okay. All right. When we get into the field also, we have, and I think we've mentioned this term before, informants, right? People that inform us of a lot of things, give us more knowledge than others, right? Traditionally, we've referred to them as subjects. I hate that word, so I never use it. It's awful, right? So tend to use more the concept of informants nowadays. And one of the things that we recognize is that our contact with these individuals oftentimes is, as you know, dangerous, right? We talked about our ethics. We talked about confidentiality, privacy, protecting very vulnerable populations. And this is how we do it, right? We code everything that we write. All of our notes, we have to be coding them because our notebooks can then be asked for in court. So all of my field books can be requested in court in any kind of a case related to the work that I've done. So if I have names that are there, then it immediately identifies the people that I'm working with, which can potentially have huge problems, right? Another reminder about an example being one of the gentlemen that I was with over the summer. His family sold land, right, and it was banked right up against the wall near the Kotel or the Wailing Wall, and he sold the land with using another intermediary, and the land went from Muslim hands to Jewish hands. And for his community, that meant that he was under a death sentence, okay? So me showing pictures of this gentleman and me going like this would be a horrible thing for me to do because I could potentially put him into problem. Yes? So if I don't protect him by coding everything, if I don't protect him by demanding to know, do we share these pictures? Do we not share these pictures? I sign consent with him, yeah, in ways of protecting him. Because it's important that he knows that just being seen in my work might potentially be a problem in those regards, okay? So locking all my files as well. At the end of everything, we destroy our codebook. Unfortunately, we did this before Nicaragua had all of the data that they wanted. They wanted all the names. If they were going to put names down on titles for Awastingni, they wanted all the original code work. So guess what happened? We destroyed them. I had to go back and do the whole thing again. Suck. It was a lot of work, and I was the only one that was up there before. We had a team of 20, right? So we do destroy the code books, but when it comes to land, it's another issue. Because we want to put their names on the title, right? You can't like give title to somebody without a name, right? And we can give title to a nation, but the nation has to be made up of some people, right? So names are difficult and questionable when we get into that kind of research. Okay. All right. Reliability, validity. These are issues that we have in science. You should know that both economics and psychology admitted in the last 6 months that they've got huge problems with this. What we see the most of, let's take a look at what each one is first, okay? So validity, we're taking a look at this. This means that we're truly looking at the phenomena that we're trying to look at, okay? So did we look at the right thing, meaning did we use the right measurements to see the right thing? For example, when we define conservation, did we define it correctly? Did we define it so that we can really understand who's conserving and who's not? Or did we mess up, okay? So that's one way, all right? That's what we're talking about in terms of validity. Now, reliability is, oh yeah, this is a reliable series of results in that I've taken the same methods that they used, repeated it, and I got the same results. Therefore, the science is solid, right? Have you heard about that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Economics, psychology, and food science in the last 6 months admitted that they are horrifically understaffed for this kind of thing right now. We are not repeating our studies in economics, food science, and psychology. You should think about what that means because we have a lot of results coming out from those departments, right? Everything from different kinds of consumerism to different kinds of foods that are safe or not safe, right? To different kinds of concepts of our mental health, especially in our country. We're at the forefront of these kinds of discussions, right? The manuals of mental health, right? So these two issues are incredibly important, and the latter even more so when you're looking at what we're finding, okay? Here's another little link that I put in here for you. A piece of new news, right? January this year. Let's see if I can get this out of here. Okay. The question is, can sustainable development goals be measured by satellite? Right? That meaning, can we literally look at sustainability goals, be it climate or whatever have you, and be able to measure whether or not we're accomplishing those goals. Like say, look at the forest coverage of Central America and how much money we've put into the sustainable goals for Central America. Is it accomplishing what we're doing, right? What's the dollar to acre of forest that we're getting there? You see what I mean? Yeah. So this is an important consideration because the UN is using a lot of this kind of assessment for looking at climate and all kinds of things. So there are some things to consider when you look at the maps that we're using, because the scale that we're looking at might give different kinds of information. Okay, so important link for you to take a look at, especially if you like information about forests and forestry, right? Okay, so inferential statistics was where we were getting at. We have some kind of an interesting thing that we do in science, and I'll just remind you of it. I'm sure you've heard of it. We call it the method of falsification. Might kind of remember it, right? What it means is that we can't 100% prove anything, right? So instead of saying almost, we say we flip the hypothesis and say how much it's not that way. By example, let's say we might take the knowledge of terraformers of birds, okay, endangered water birds. We might say terraformers know very little in comparison to scientists about endangered water birds, right? As opposed to saying, yeah, they know a lot more, right? Which I kind of think maybe they do, but the hypothesis we want to test is the flip, right? And we call that the null hypothesis. Where'd that go? Right here, the null hypothesis. Okay, so that's our flip of what we think our theory might be. Terraformers know a lot about endangered waters. No, they don't. We flip it, and we'll test how wrong that is. Okay, kind of a weird way of doing things, right? All right, then I think that you ought to know this last piece about, last couple of pieces, okay, about what we call the p-value. How many people have ever heard of something called the p-value? Yay, oh good, all right. Okay, so this is important if you're looking at Nature magazine, Science magazine, and some of your statistics that are coming out of tests, right? The p-value is how likely it is that we're going to reject that null hypothesis, right? So how important a correlation might be between, let's say, rain and the population of stilts, which is pretty high because they all enjoy the rain, right? Okay. So if we have a p-value that's less than or equal to 0.05 or smaller, very interesting correlation. If we get one that's above, not so interesting. Okay, so you should know the cutoff point for these things, right? When you're reading all of the things that you are in the professional journals, you should know what the measurement is. Don't forget our funny little statistics test, right? If I have 2 feet, is that average number of feet for a human? No, it's considered above average, right? Because there's nobody with 3 feet, but there's people with no feet and 1 feet, right? Look at the math, right? Please don't forget how we assess averages. Okay, that's your little test for averages, right? Go home to your family and raise the question and surprise them. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Okay, all right, let's keep moving on. Fieldwork. Talked about length of time. Right? I want to remind you that there are still some topics that I have with the Miagne that I've been working with for over 25 years, still don't know, right? So being in the field, very, very important. Some topics you will never get to, right? Not to feel bad about that. That's just the way it is, right? Okay. Also, many of us, when we're going in to do some of the work that we do, we try not to go on our own accord. And a lot of us tend to prefer to be asked, right? Or invited. A little bit difficult when you're starting off, but when you get going with your work, to come into a place and say, I'm here to help you with Indigenous land rights can be really offensive, right? We had one experience where we were working with the Nature Conservancy, brought into a territory to tell them that we were there to help support their legal right to land. We were going to help them map their lands, record their legal right, go to court, defend it, all that kind of great stuff, right? Sounds good, right? And they said, who the hell are you to tell us who owns our land? I guess you're right, right? But here's what happened, right? The state, the nation state, the country of Nicaragua decided to call their lands a park. Wasn't my deal, but I was the first one there explaining that, yeah, but guess what, right? So they weren't very happy, okay? But little by little, as people began to understand what was happening in Nicaragua, we had people that would come into our offices and say, hey, can you come help us out? We know what you're doing. We know what you do. We don't know how to do it, and we need to defend our land. And that was just how we wanted to work, right? Rather than showing up first, okay? So that's one kind of thing that we do as applied anthropologists. Languages. Remember we talked about women, and I said this stupid, ridiculous comment about how I wasn't able to get to the women's female voice, right? Because of lack of language, right? If I have the ability to learn that obscure language, one group I work with, only 5 speakers. What do you do with that? I don't know, right? They did speak another local dialect that was similar to others, so I could learn the predominant dialect. But again, there's 3 to 4 different dialects just within the Mayagna. So learning the language is cumbersome at best for me, right? So going to have to maybe hire some interpreters and remember what it means to work with interpreters. One example, I went around asking about conservation. I made the mistake of saying, let's write the question, do you do anything that you think of as conservation, right? And so we started asking the question, and my interpreter sitting next to me, interviewing the individual, said, you know what conservation is, don't you? You know that conservation means not harvesting everything, don't you? It was a pilot study, so it was okay, right? I could see what was happening, but wow, interpreters potentially can mess everything up, right? I mean, essentially, he was giving them the answer. I wasn't going to be able to get any kind of clear answer with that, right? So, something to think about, right? Right. A lot of our work, we use maps. Oops. Okay. And we can talk more about that as we go along. We'll get into that when we talk about defending land and land rights and human rights. Okay. Wellness in the field. A number of us have different kinds of issues that we've dealt with in the field. One of my colleagues that was one of my professors went to China in the Yunnan province and lost all the hair on his body. No eyebrows, no arm hair, no nothing, and very, very, for the rest of his life, right? One of the things that happened to me when I was in Awastingni, remember we burned all the names that were connected. I had to go back, right? When I had to go back, it was during the rainy season, which meant that all of our water was coming from the trickles of this little stream, and we all got sick, like really badly sick. The only thing we had was penicillin, right? For like couple months, right? And I came home, sent off my little samples to the CDC, and they said, this is something of unknown origin. And they gave me antibiotics for my stomach to kill what it was in my stomach for 3 months. Killed everything there. Don't get hungry very much anymore. That's just the way it is. So I've had to force feed myself frequently in the field and in other times as well, just because of that loss for appetite that happened because of being in the field, right? Another occasion, I was there with a student, right? We were sleeping in the chief's house. We had just been in the middle of litigation defending land rights, right? It's about maybe 15 people that we were taking to court that had illegally claimed that they'd bought indigenous land, even though it wasn't possible to be sold. 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, shots went right by my window to scare us, specifically myself and my student. right? I mean, they had guns. There were guns all around, right? AK-47s, machetes, you name it, all kinds of stuff going on. So often in the field, we have to hire security guards. I had a security guard with me all the time that time, right? The reality of being in the field and working on those kinds of things was it was dangerous. We had shock when we came out of it, right? We were driving real fast to get to the airplane to get us the fast out of there, right? So there are some experiences that we have as anthropologists where it's dangerous in the field. Yeah, we like Indiana Jones and all those movies, right? And all the excitement that comes in with it. And that's why a lot of people went into anthropology. But it can be really dangerous in some of the situations that we choose to put ourselves in, especially those working with the military. Remember, we had some deaths, right? So there was also a gentleman 2 years ago in Tel Aviv mall that was shot and killed. That was an anthropologist working there as well. So things happen, and we tend to want to be coordinated with U.S. consulates, U.S. governments, U.S. embassies. I'm always on something that's called SOS insurance, which provides for emergency evacs, right? I don't go places that don't have it, the ability, which is everywhere. You know, there's some companies that just go in everywhere, right? So another thing that is a piece of our research that we can't avoid to talk about, and that is we get to leave. That's luxurious for some of us, right? My friends, the Mayagna, they're still dealing with colonists coming in and going to their watering well with guns and AK-47s threatening their kids, right? Other friends of mine in the Middle East, gosh darn it, one of my best friends that was going to be director of projects was stabbed 2 weeks after I got home. Killed, gone, right? So a lot of the people that we work with suffer through a lot of things with human rights, and we end up dealing with that in the field, and luxuriously we get to come home. So we need to think about our role in raising the voice and being advocates, right? And how we look at training others in the field to be able to speak for themselves, self-determination wise, yeah? That's what we were talking about within the news, okay? All right, any other comments? When we're talking about our ideal role, we say facilitation and training. In other words, not driving the projects, right? Participatory methods where we help others learn. Community-based kinds of things that aren't top-down, that come from the grassroots, driven from what we say the inside rather than the outside, right? Advocacy. When we talk about local institutional strengthening, we're also talking about helping groups deal with the larger nation states, right? One of the things Nicaragua said about their land rights is, we don't know how to see the indigenous people, right? Weird. So they said, legally, you're going to have to look like what we call an NGO. Anybody know what that means? What is it? Non-government organization, all right? You got to have a president, vice president, secretary, members, blah, 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 blah. 7 members, we said, or they said, right? And the indigenous people said, this is weird. We're elders councils. We don't look like this strange 7 grouping of elected people. We don't even elect them. They're elders. It gets passed down, right? So one of the things that we did was not strengthen their institutions in that regard. We mandated something new. And now, corruption all over the place. Now we have to go back and figure out how to strengthen those institutions that we demanded that they have. So institutional strengthening is part of this. Capacity building is another buzzword that we like to use rather than needs, right? You've heard needs assessments, needs focused. This one is more focused on capacity. So, all right, that's all I have to say for methods today. And when we come back, let's take a look at our topic when we come back. Remember, don't forget your quiz and your research essay topic. wait. Before you go, let's take a, hold on. Let's take a quick look at the quiz, okay? Defining culture, differences between archaeology and paleontology, ethical concerns, we went over that. NAGPRA, went over that, right? You got all your links there on the lecture. Unilinear evolution, you remember this? Lewis Henry Morgan, right? And one stage, you got to look like these stages, and okay. Interpretivists and postmodernists, remember what they have to say, okay? I think we went over everything, yes? Okay, all right. We'll see you next week when we start talking about colonialism, ethics, and world systems. And I will go off now.